Okay, this is Social Stratification, Chapter 7, Part 3. So you've already watched the video where it talked about wealth distribution and how it is at a point where most Americans are struggling and living to paycheck. And I think for most of you, it was kind of stunning to see that one person in the 1% and how it represented with all those stacks of cash. So we go back to this idea of get a job, right? And the next slide, which is slide 11, I actually have a link to the MIT Living Wage Calculator. It is this tool that economists at MIT put together where you can actually see the cost of living and the minimum and standard living wage for each county in America. So I've already selected it to Monroe County. You can look at it while you follow along with the numbers that I point out to you. Okay. So once again, this idea of, well, just go get a job. Well, for a single adult with no kids, I'm going to talk a little bit about what they figured out in terms of how much you have to make and then how much they rationed for each of these items. So as you see for the single person with no kids, that a living wage in Monroe County is $12 an hour. $6 would be a poverty wage, and $11 is the minimum, $11.10 is the minimum wage in New York State. So what they argue in this case is that as a single adult with no children, you have to make approximately $25,000 a year in order to just make your basic living standards. Not anything extra, not anything extravagant, just your basics. Now, what I do want to point out to you is that when you look at the food allowance that they gave a single person with no kids, they basically have it listed as $3,000 and almost $3,500. Now, you divide that by how many days there are, and you see that it's actually less than $10 a day. Now, for my online classes, there is actually an assignment that you can do where you try to live off of $10 of food a day. And what I find is that most students actually struggle quite a bit with that task. Okay, so it's not enough. Same thing for the housing allowance. As you see, it is $7,800. That would actually average out to $650 a month. And as a single adult with no kids, it would probably be a little bit difficult to find a one-bedroom apartment that was only $650 a month. Okay, so what you find is that even though the minimum wage is supposed to provide basic living, that for a single person with no children, it would actually be minimum wages actually underneath the amount that you need. Now, I want you to kind of go to the end of the chart where it has 2 working adults and 2 kids. Now, I'm skipping the one where there's 1 working adult because that is actually not the reality for most families now. Most then you are looking at 2 working adults in any given family. For each adult that works, what you see is that each adult has to make almost $20 an hour in order to make basic living wages, right? So each one making $20 an hour, that $6.20 would actually be a poverty wage in that case. And then the minimum wage, of course, once again, is $11.10. Why do I bring this one up? Because if you look at the food allowance for this, then it is actually, they only ration about $10,000 a year for food for a family of 4, which actually comes down to less than $7 a day for each person. Now, I said it's a struggle to live off of $10 of food a day. It kind of makes sense a little bit if you're feeding a family of 4 and you are looking at, infants or toddlers who don't eat as much. However, if you're feeding a family of 4 and the 2 kids are actually 14 and 16, 14 and 16-year-olds actually eat a lot more than most adults do. So what you find is that that number actually isn't enough to cover adequate amount of food for a family of 4. That the housing allowance then is $24,000. Transportation then only at $11,000, which once again for a family of 4 actually seems on the low end. The staggering amount though in terms of average household income in order to make basic living wage at that point to meet the standards of living is $83,000, right? It is a far cry then from the $24,000 poverty level that we have raised, that we have at the federal poverty line, because what you see is it doesn't even come close. Okay, so I want you to take a look at those charts so that you can get a better understanding of how these numbers are calculated in terms of minimum versus standard living wages. So on slide 12 then, I actually look at the concept of poverty, because when social stratification gets mentioned, it is this idea of social inequality, that when it comes to social inequality then poverty is the primary social problem that we are looking at. So we make a division in sociology between the types of poverty that you can talk about. Now, the first one is absolute poverty. Now, in absolute poverty, you are looking at the inability to secure the basic necessities of life. That is the idea of getting clean water to drink, food to eat, shelter, and clothing. And what you see in this case is that even though we do have Americans who struggle and who are in absolute poverty, that generally when you think of places that are in absolute poverty, you look at disaster-stricken areas, right, where there isn't even clean water available to drink. In the United States, then, instead we look at this concept called relative poverty. That this one is actually a comparative measure. So you're not looking at poverty as absolute, you're looking at it as in a comparison that situates poverty within the wealth distribution of a society. What happens in capitalism, because you are looking at a system of social stratification, and because you look in capitalism as the people on top actually having the most money and the least amount of people, relative poverty is actually a characteristic of capitalism, right? You can't really have capitalism without having a huge base of labor that actually feeds to kind of make the people at the top wealthier. Okay, so we're going to talk about the issues that occur with poverty and how it is strongly correlated with race and ethnicity in the United States. So on slide 13, we go back to this idea that I mentioned in the beginning of the semester, and that is the idea of intersectionality and the matrix of inequality. Now, this theorist, and remember I said that there was something that looked very different about the intersectional feminist theories that from all the classical theories, because you are looking at them proposed and put out there by Black female scholars. And this one is Patricia Hill Collins. And what she argues is that when we look at this idea of inequality, it's not enough to look at it as unidimensional, right? Instead, we have to look at it as an interaction between the factors of social class, race, gender, and sexuality. And what Hill Collins mentions then is, and basically puts out there, is that all of these dimensions actually interact in different ways for each individual, basically making different outcomes for all people. Okay, so in this case, what we say is that race, gender, and sexuality all impact your socioeconomic status. It's all intertwined. You can't really separate one from the other. And it's important to note here that every person actually occupies dimensions of both privilege and oppression at the same time. It's not an either or, it's that you are both and, or actually I say more than both and. So I give myself as an example because you can actually see that as a person of color, as an Asian American, then it opens me up to discrimination in terms of my race. In terms of gender, then also then being female also opens me up to discrimination along those lines. However, you can actually say that I am privileged in that I come from highly educated parents who were very, very concerned with me also being highly educated. And also I'm straight, I'm cisgendered. That is a dimension of privilege that I occupy. So when you are thinking about this idea of inequality and social inequality, you can't just simply look at it in a unidimensional way. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about next then is this idea of the concentration of poverty in the Rochester area. And I've given you a link to the Rochester poverty maps. It's easier to demonstrate these when I'm in class and I can actually pull them up on the screen and go over all of these areas with you. But if you open up and examine the link yourself, what you can see is that in any in any city pretty much, what you find is that the urban areas then actually have much higher rates of poverty, right, than the outer suburbs. And in Rochester, we also are looking at what I call the 90%, 10% split, right? So if you look at those poverty maps and what they tell you is then the poverty rates of the area, they look at average household income, they look at things like how much it costs to rent or own in that area. And what you find is that within this city, when you're looking at the highest concentrations of poverty, those tracts are generally 90% Black and Latinx people, with less than 10% then being white or Asian American. On the other hand, when you go to these suburbs, and I always pick on Webster because you guys can take a look at the Webster area, that you're looking at a very, very low poverty rates in some of these tracts. In some of the cases, you are looking at less than 5% poverty, but you also look and it is over 90% white in a lot of those areas. Okay, so what you're looking at then is a conflation of race and social class. So I kind of encourage you guys, play around with those maps. I always say that in class. I don't know how many people go home and actually look at them, but right now you do have to look at them on your own. And what you quickly realize is that we are looking at a high level of residential segregation in the Rochester area. I will say that it is actually much more segregated than I'm used to seeing, having come from Houston, which at this point we are looking at much fewer whites in Houston than people of color, or from LA. What you see in Rochester is that you are looking at the residential segregation being very stark. So in slide 15, I actually have two schools that are less than 5 miles apart from each other, but are zoned to different school districts. And what you can see then are the outcomes of what poverty does to student success, to the graduation rates, and to college readiness. So I encourage you to look at those statistics so that you can compare. Okay. So what happens? A lot of people ask me, well, racial segregation is illegal, right? So how does it still happen? Well, what happens when it comes to residential segregation, race, and class, take a look at slide 16, where I actually make a distinction between the types of segregation. Now, one form of segregation is de jure segregation, and de jure basically means by law in Latin. And by law, racial segregation is illegal. We all learned about Brown v. Board of Education, which happened in 1954, which basically said you cannot segregate on the basis of race. Now, what happened at that point in time in America is that there was forced desegregation in the South that the National Guard, the military, was actually called in to the South in order to desegregate, to make sure that the schools were integrated. That actually did not happen in the North in droves. And so actually what happened is, because it wasn't enforced in the North, you actually see then that there is quite a bit of residential segregation in the North. Okay, so residential segregation versus racial. De facto segregation is by practice. And what I say in slide 16 is that residential segregation is legal, right? And it basically has the same effects as racial segregation. Because essentially what you're arguing is that your zip code then affects the funding for the school that you are zoned to. And how do you pay for schools? You do it with taxes in the tax base. So it makes sense that people who pay higher taxes actually end up with better schools than those who pay lower taxes. Now, what happens with de facto segregation? Because I just said racial segregation is illegal. So why do we still have racial segregation? Well, by practice, what you see is that it's actually illegal to segregate within a school district. So if you have one school district, you can't actually have great racial disparities in between the schools within the school district. It's perfectly legal then to segregate between school districts. That is, if you have, say, the Pittsford Sutherland School District and you have the Rochester City School District, those two things are seen as separate and distinct. So if there is segregation along those lines, it is perfectly legal. Okay. And what happens, once again, is that Rochester does have this 90%, 10% split, that if you look at the Rochester City School District, you're seeing that these schools are primarily about 90% then Black and Latino and 10% white. That in the suburban areas that you are looking at 90% white and 10% students who are Black and Latinx. Okay. So I'm going to stop here. The next section then will be about the concentration of poverty and talking more about the effects of residential segregation. But for right now, go back and take a look at all the charts and the maps that I talked about and prepare then to go on to talk more about concentrated poverty.